I woke up one Saturday morning to find that my own ranch had been sealed off like a crime scene, but instead of yellow tape it was cheap metal fencing that stretched across my driveway with a giant padlocked gate dangling like a taunt. And the funniest yet most infuriating part was that the Homeowners Association president stood behind it sipping iced tea as if she had just conquered Rome, while my cattle mooed on the other side like hostages demanding ransom. That was the moment I realized two things at once. First, that the HOA had completely lost its mind, and second, that I was about to make them regret ever thinking they could outsmart me on my own land. The shock of that morning carried a sting that was equal parts hilarious and outrageous. My ranch had been in the family for generations, wide open stretches of pasture and oak trees, a creek that curved through the middle, and a dusty road that led down to the barns and my house. It was my sanctuary, my pride, the one place where I could breathe freely, yet somehow a group of nosy suburban busybodies who owned 2-acre plots a mile away decided they had authority to box me in like I was some misbehaving child. They claimed the road through my property was a shared community access point, and that they were tired of me allowing delivery trucks and farm equipment to use it. What they never bothered to admit was that the road belonged entirely to me, deeded to my great-grandfather long before any HOA was even formed. But entitlement doesn't read land records and arrogance never waits for facts. I stood there staring at that new fence line, my truck stuck on the wrong side, my horses looking at me as if I had betrayed them, and Karen herself, the queen of the HOA, grinning smugly while explaining that this was now a controlled entrance for the neighborhood. She even had the nerve to wave a little clipboard and announce that I could request a key once I signed the HOA's new compliance agreement, which included, get this, a ban on early morning tractor noise, a fee for every livestock trailer I parked, and mandatory landscaping reviews for the front portion of my ranch. I nearly choked from laughing and boiling rage at the same time. It was so absurd I thought hidden cameras might pop out from behind the oak trees. But no cameras appeared, only Karen and her army of clipboard warriors who whispered among themselves while eyeing my ranch like a victory parade. They honestly believed they had me cornered, that a fence and a lock could strip me of ownership and independence. What they didn't expect was that I had dealt with storms, droughts, and market crashes before, and none of those broke me. A metal fence put up overnight by an overzealous HOA was nothing compared to nature's fury, and unlike nature, these people had weaknesses that could be exposed. The first subchapter of this story unfolded with me pacing outside the gate, fury bubbling but humor keeping me steady. I asked Karen politely, or at least with the tone of a man about to blow, what gave her the right to blockade me on my own land. She smirked and said the board voted unanimously that controlling the road was in the best interest of the neighborhood. My jaw nearly hit the ground. I reminded her that my property line didn't just cross the road, it owned it outright, every inch. She tilted her head and said, "Oh well, if that's true we can settle this in court, but until then the gate stays." She turned her back and sipped her drink as though she had just delivered the final word of a trial. I felt my temper surge, yet something else bloomed too, the first spark of a plan. I decided to play along, at least for the moment. If they wanted to block me, fine, I'd climb over the fence, haul my groceries under the bars, and let them think they had scored a victory. I'd let them laugh at the rancher dragging bags of feed by hand. What they didn't know was that while I was sweating and hauling, I was also digging into every record, every deed, every scrap of legal paper tied to this land. The deeper I looked, the more gold I found, and the clearer it became that I had weapons far sharper than bolt cutters. The second subchapter of that day came with me at the county office, holding maps older than Karen's entire subdivision, showing property lines that placed the road, the gate, and even part of their little decorative fence inside my ownership. The clerk chuckled as she stamped copies for me, saying she'd never seen someone try to fence off their neighbor's land with such confidence. I walked out with documents tucked under my arm like ammunition. I didn't need to break the lock. I needed to break their illusion. Back at the ranch, the HOA members had gathered as though it were a block party, bragging about their victory, even stringing up a banner that read private community access. They cheered when Karen announced they were protecting property values, that my ranch activity had to be regulated for the good of everyone. The irony was so thick I nearly gagged. My ranch was the very reason their neighborhood even existed, the open fields and rustic charm sold to them as part of the lifestyle package. Without my ranch, they'd just be houses on dirt. But logic was wasted on people who thrived on control. That evening, as the sun set red over the hills, I sat on my porch watching the shadows stretch long across the new fence line. My cattle had figured out how to lean against the panels, rattling them loose, almost mocking the human drama. I realized then that this wasn't just about a gate. It was about pride, ownership, and a group of entitled folks who thought a majority vote could rewrite history. That realization gave me a kind of giddy energy, the kind that bubbles when you know you're about to turn the tables in a way nobody expects. The third subchapter began with a flash of inspiration. Gates are just doors with egos, and doors always have keys. While the HOA held the padlock key, I discovered through my property records that the gate itself was installed on a section of land technically mine. That meant the gate wasn't their property at all, it was mine by default. With the right paperwork, I could claim ownership of the very thing they thought controlled me. The sheer hilarity of it hit me like a punchline. They had locked themselves into a future where I was about to own the very obstacle they built against me. As I fell asleep that night, the glow of the porch light flickering across the metal bars of their shiny new fence, I knew this was just the beginning. Chapter 1 closed not with me defeated, but with me grinning in the dark, holding a folder of deeds like a deck of winning cards. The HOA had started a game they couldn't win, and I was ready to play it to the last twist. The next morning came with the sound of Karen's voice echoing across the ranch like a rooster that never knew when to quit. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee, only to find her perched proudly beside the new gate with a folding chair, a thermos, and a stack of HOA documents as if she were guarding Fort Knox. She had even set up a little sign-in sheet for anyone entering or leaving, like my land had been converted into some exclusive resort check-in counter. Neighbors in golf carts lined up with smug smiles, signing their names before passing through, treating my ranch road as if it were their newly conquered trophy. The absurdity was staggering, but the more ridiculous it became, the more determined I was to let their own arrogance pile higher until it was ready to topple over on them. I walked up to the gate with deliberate calm, sipping my coffee, and asked her if she was enjoying her new office. She narrowed her eyes and waved the clipboard at me, declaring that from now on, all traffic on this road required HOA approval. She emphasized the words as if they carried the weight of law. I raised an eyebrow and asked if that included my tractors hauling hay, my trucks delivering supplies, and even me walking across my own road to feed my livestock. With the kind of grin only someone drunk on power could manage, she said yes, especially me. She wanted to make sure I understood that their authority was absolute. The crowd chuckled, a ripple of laughter from folks who thought they were part of some historic victory. I didn't respond with anger, though every muscle in me itched to tear the gate down with my bare hands. Instead, I leaned against the fence, took another long sip of coffee, and told her I'd be happy to play by her rules, just so long as she remembered that rules work both ways. She scoffed and said the HOA had decades of experience in managing compliance, as if she were the general of some suburban army. I smiled, tipped my hat, and walked back to the house, but inside my head I was already setting the pieces for the next move. The first subchapter of this new phase unfolded at the county office once again. I spent hours digging through not only land deeds but also easement rights, HOA bylaws, and obscure county regulations. What I discovered was a goldmine of contradictions. Their bylaws clearly stated that HOA jurisdiction ended at the property line of its members, and since my ranch was never part of their association, none of their rules applied to me. Yet here they were, fencing off my land, enforcing traffic logs, and collecting signatures. That meant they weren't just being obnoxious neighbors, They were committing trespass and extortion under the guise of community regulation. My lawyer chuckled when I explained it, telling me that if I wanted, I could file charges that might stick harder than the mud after a storm. But I told him to hold off, because I had a feeling letting the HOA keep digging their own hole would be far more entertaining. Back at the ranch, things escalated like a circus gone wild. Karen and her board members decided to implement something they called a gate fee. They stood proudly at the entrance collecting $5 from every car that passed through, waving receipts printed on their home office printers. The neighbors played along like sheep, some even thanking her for protecting their property values. Then came the kicker. When I drove up with a load of feed for my horses, she demanded $10 for heavy vehicle use. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on the granola bar I was eating. I told her I'd gladly pay the fee if she could show me one legal document proving she had authority over my road. She sputtered, flustered, and then yelled that the community had spoken, and that was authority enough. I tossed the granola wrapper onto the ground, told her she could fine me for littering too if she wanted, and drove my truck right through the gate, rattling it hard enough to send her coffee splashing into her lap. The second subchapter of this madness was their retaliation. A few nights later, I heard hammering and the roar of a generator near the entrance. When I went down to investigate, I found that they had reinforced the fence with additional posts, bolted steel plates onto the gate, and even installed a keypad lock system with a code only they knew. It looked like a fortress built out of paranoia and misplaced confidence. I almost admired the effort, except it was all on my property. The nerve of it was stunning. They were so desperate to control me that they were willing to invest their time and money into fortifying something they had no right to. I didn't try to stop them, though. I stood there in the shadows of my truck headlights and watched them sweat, their little flashlight beams bouncing around like fireflies. Each bang of their hammer was another nail sealing their own coffin of arrogance. The following day, they paraded around bragging that my access was now permanently controlled. Karen posted flyers on mailboxes claiming the HOA had taken steps to ensure safety and compliance, painting me as a disruptive influence who refused to respect community standard. She even accused me of endangering children with my farm equipment. The irony was that most of the kids in the neighborhood loved visiting my ranch, feeding my goats, and riding the horses I occasionally let them borrow for short trot. I had always been the friendly neighbor, the one with open gates and an open heart, until this circus turned me into their public enemy number one. The third subchapter came with an unexpected twist. While the HOA was celebrating their supposed victory, I received a letter from the county itself. Apparently someone from the HOA had complained about me blocking community access, but when the county inspector looked into it, they discovered that the road and the land under the new fence were registered solely to me. The letter politely informed me that if I wished, I could request immediate removal of the structure under county enforcement, or I could pursue private ownership claims for the gate itself. I laughed so loud reading that letter that my dogs started barking, thinking I had lost my mind. The HOA had just filed a complaint that ended up arming me with more authority than I had the day before. Armed with this knowledge, I walked down to the gate that evening, past the little crowd that had gathered as usual, and taped a copy of the county letter right to the steel post. Karen snatched it down and read it with growing horror, her smug expression melting like butter in the sun. The neighbors muttered among themselves, their confidence wavering. I leaned on the fence and told them I wasn't angry, I was patient, and patience always wins. I let that sink in while they stared at me like they weren't sure if I was bluffing or if I really had the upper hand. The truth was I had both, and I planned to play them at the exact moment it would sting the most. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I knew Chapter 2 of this story wasn't closing with defeat or surrender. It was closing with the HOA trapped in their own arrogance, too blind to see that the tighter they locked their gate, the more control they were handing over to me. I didn't need to shout, threaten, or fight. All I needed to do was keep letting them believe they were in charge, while the real power shifted quietly into my hands. The game was just beginning, and the next move would be mine. By the time the third chapter of this ordeal began, I had already spent days watching the HOA sink deeper into their fantasy world of control. They strutted around the new gate like proud generals, handing out codes to their chosen few, slapping fines on neighbors who forgot to sign in, and even staging what looked like security drills with clipboards and whistles. From a distance, it almost looked comical, like children playing army, except these were grown adults so consumed with the idea of power that they didn't realize the entire stage they were performing on belonged to me. I could have shut the act down at any moment with a phone call to the sheriff or the county office, but there was something delicious about letting them keep believing in their illusion. What none of them knew was that behind the scenes I was quietly setting in motion a plan that would flip their little empire upside down. The first part of that plan unfolded at the county recorder's office, where I requested detailed records not only of my own land but of every easement, access right, and modification filed over the last 20 years in the area. I pored through dusty files, maps rolled up in tubes, and old surveyor notes scribbled in faded ink until I found exactly what I was looking for. The road they had fenced off was indeed mine, clear as day, but what caught my eye was an amendment to the community charter that explicitly excluded agricultural parcels from the HOA jurisdiction. My ranch wasn't just excluded, it was immune. Their bylaws had no more effect on me than a stranger's grocery list. That realization was already satisfying, but what made it sweeter was the legal note attached to the record. Any structure built on excluded property without permission could be claimed by the landowner. In other words, the very gate they had erected could become mine with the right paperwork filed. It was like discovering their weapon was already wired to explode in their hand. The second part of the plan was more theatrical. I visited a property lawyer who specialized in land disputes, a sharp man with a sharper grin who had seen more HOA battles than he could count. I laid out the documents, explained the situation, and watched his eyebrows shoot up with amusement. He told me that technically, not only could I claim the gate, but I could also invoice them for trespassing and damages for every day it remained. I laughed and told him I wasn't after money, at least not yet. What I wanted was leverage, the kind of leverage that would make them squirm publicly, force them to recognize that their power trip had backfired in front of the entire community. He leaned back in his chair and said I had the makings of a masterstroke. With his help, I drafted the paperwork to purchase the gate outright under the trespass clause, turning it from their symbol of authority into my personal property. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. They had locked me out with a gate they didn't own, and soon I would own it entirely. The third part of the plan came with a touch of humor that I couldn't resist. Once the paperwork was filed, I took a leisurely drive back to the ranch, humming to myself like a man returning from a shopping spree. I parked my truck right in front of the gate where Karen and her loyal crew were stationed with their clipboards, and with the calmest smile I announced that I had just come from the county office. They smirked, waiting for me to admit defeat, waiting for me to grovel for access. Instead, I reached into my glove box and pulled out a fresh document stamped with the county seal, the ink barely dry, stating that the gate now legally belonged to me as the landowner whose property it occupied. Their laughter faltered. Karen snatched the paper, her eyes darting across the lines, her face shifting from smugness to disbelief to fury. The crowd behind her gasped as if they had witnessed a magician pull a rabbit out of a hat. I leaned against the fence and told them plainly that from this day forward, the gate was mine, and anyone passing through would need my approval. The silence that followed was sweeter than any applause. What happened next was nothing short of chaos. Karen shouted that it had to be fake, that I had forged the document. She threatened to call the sheriff, to call her lawyer, to call anyone who would listen. I shrugged and told her to go ahead, that I'd be happy to show the sheriff the same county records that proved my ownership. A few of the neighbors started whispering nervously, realizing they had been paying fees to use a gate that wasn't even theirs. Some demanded refunds on the spot. Others quietly slipped away, not wanting to be associated with the humiliation. Karen's voice cracked as she tried to rally them, but the more she screamed, the more foolish she looked, standing there with a clipboard while the foundation of her power crumbled under her feet. The next few days became a theater of desperation. The HOA board scrambled to hold emergency meetings, sending out flyers declaring that my claim was illegitimate, urging residents to stand strong against my so-called tyranny. But the more they fought, the more documents I released, copies of deeds and amendments that made their arguments look like children scribbling on scrap paper. Each time they tried to impose a new rule, I countered with evidence that I was outside their jurisdiction. Each time they tried to collect fees, I reminded them that they were trespassing on my property. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood began to see the cracks in their leadership. Confidence turned into doubt, and doubt turned into quiet rebellion. The funniest part of all was watching them still attempt to act in control. Karen would set up her chair at the gate as usual, demanding sign-ins, even as residents rolled their eyes and muttered about her delusions. One neighbor told me privately that people were beginning to mock her behind closed doors, calling the gate Karen's folly, a monument to arrogance. I couldn't have scripted it better myself. As satisfying as it was, I wasn't done yet. Owning the gate wasn't just about proving a point, it was about turning their own strategy against them in a way that left no doubt about who held the real power. With ownership transferred, I had the right to modify the gate however I saw fit, and that included the ability to lock it from my side. The very tool they used to fence me out was about to become the trap that fenced them in. The thought of it made me laugh aloud one evening as I sat on my porch, watching the sunset pour gold across the hills. For once, the air felt lighter, as if the land itself was sharing in my amusement. The chapter closed with me standing by the gate in the quiet of night, running my hand along the steel as if it were some loyal horse I had just tamed. The moonlight glinted off the padlock, now mine to control, and I whispered to myself that patience had been worth it. The HOA thought they had written me into a corner, but I had just rewritten the ending of their story. The gate they built to contain me was now the cage they would never see coming, and when the moment was right, I would slam it shut with every ounce of irony the universe had to offer. The moment Chapter 4 began, it felt as if the air itself carried a new tension. The HOA had lost the symbolic battle over the gate, but instead of backing down gracefully, they chose to double their efforts, throwing tantrums disguised as strategy. Every morning I would find Karen parked in her folding chair near the gate, scribbling furiously in her notebook, surrounded by a shrinking number of loyal followers who still believed her speeches about saving property values and maintaining order. The funny thing was, their so-called order had become absolute chaos. Neighbors were beginning to complain not about me, but about the HOA itself. They were tired of paying fees for a gate that no longer served them, tired of the embarrassment of having to explain to visiting family why they had to sign in and pay tolls on a road that wasn't even theirs. Still, Karen clung to her illusion of authority, barking orders at anyone who would listen, convinced that she could somehow spin the situation back in her favor. I knew the time had come to stop merely collecting victories on paper and start showing them what true ownership looked like in practice. With the paperwork in hand confirming that the gate was now legally mine, I decided to put on a performance of my own. One Saturday morning, while the HOA board was setting up their little checkpoint as usual, I strolled down the road with a toolbox slung over my shoulder and a new padlock gleaming in my hand. Without a word, I unlocked the old padlock, removed it, and clicked my shiny new one into place. The sound of that lock snapping shut echoed louder than any speech Karen had ever given. She jumped up from her chair, her face turning red as she demanded to know what I was doing. I told her calmly that as the owner of the gate, I had every right to secure it as I pleased. From now on, the only keys belonged to me. The crowd erupted into shocked murmurs, some laughing nervously, others stepping back as if they wanted no part of the storm brewing before them. Karen screeched that I was holding the neighborhood hostage, that I was abusing my power. The irony nearly made me choke. I reminded her that it was she and her board who had built the gate, locked it, and charged fees for its use. All I had done was by what they had so generously constructed on my land. If they wanted to complain about being fenced in, perhaps they should take a long look at their own handiwork. Her jaw dropped as if the weight of that truth had just cracked it in half. Neighbors began whispering louder now, some pointing out that she had spent HOA funds on the gate and keypad system, which was now in my hands. The betrayal in their eyes wasn't aimed at me anymore, it was aimed at her. The first subchapter of this shift was the outrage that followed within the HOA rank. Emergency meetings were called almost every evening, their community hall packed with frustrated residents demanding answers. Voices rose, fingers pointed, and Karen tried desperately to spin the narrative that I had somehow manipulated the system. But each time she spoke, someone would wave a copy of the deed, or mention the county inspector's letter, or remind her that she was the one who insisted the gate was necessary in the first place. I didn't even have to defend myself anymore. The residents were doing it for me, realizing they had been dragged into a losing battle fueled by one woman's obsession with control. The satisfaction of watching them turn on their own leader was richer than any legal victory could have been. The second subchapter came with their attempts at retaliation. Late one night I heard vehicles pull up near the gate, engines idling low, voices muttering in the dark. When I crept closer, I saw a group of board members fumbling with tools, clearly trying to cut through my new padlock and reclaim what they thought was theirs. I let them sweat for a while, listening to their whispered panic as their bolt cutters failed to break through the reinforced lock I had chosen. Finally, I clicked on my truck's headlights, flooding them in bright light. They froze like deer caught in a trap. I stepped out, arms crossed, and asked them politely if they needed help opening their own cage. The humiliation was palpable. They scattered like guilty teenagers caught sneaking home after curfew. The next morning, word spread across the neighborhood, and the HOA's reputation dropped even further. People laughed at the idea of their leaders sneaking around in the dark, trying to break into a gate they once bragged about controlling. The third subchapter was when the HOA, desperate and cornered, decided to escalate things officially. Karen filed a lawsuit claiming I had stolen the gate and was unlawfully restricting access to the community. When the summons arrived, I almost laughed myself sick. They had walked right into another trap without realizing it. My lawyer assured me that not only was the case flimsy, but it would also give us the chance to present all the evidence in open court, exposing their actions for everyone to see. Sure enough, when the day came, the courtroom filled with neighbors eager to watch the showdown. Karen strutted in with a stack of papers and her attorney, while I arrived with my lawyer and a folder of deeds thicker than a phone book. The judge barely needed 20 minutes to see through their nonsense. My lawyer laid out the property lines, the amendment excluding my ranch from HOA jurisdiction, and the documents transferring ownership of the gate to me. Karen tried to interrupt, claiming it was unfair, but the judge silenced her with a stern warning. When the ruling came down in my favor, the sound of gavel striking wood was like thunder rolling over a valley. Not only did I retain ownership of the gate, but the HOA was ordered to reimburse me for legal costs and warned against further interference with my land. The look on Karen's face as she stumbled out of that courtroom was worth every ounce of patience I had endured. She had tried to make me the villain, but now she was the clown of the entire community. Back at the ranch, I stood by the gate one evening watching the sun sink low behind the hills, the orange light glowing against the steel bars. It was no longer a symbol of oppression or arrogance. It was a trophy, a reminder that sometimes the best way to fight arrogance is with patience and strategy. As I locked the gate behind me and pocketed the only key, I felt a surge of satisfaction that went beyond personal victory. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every farmer, every landowner, every person who had ever been pushed around by entitled neighbors or overreaching associations. The message was clear. Build a cage for someone else, and you might just end up trapped in it yourself. Chapter 4 closed with the HOA in disarray, its leaders humiliated, its members divided, and its credibility shattered. The gate they had once paraded as their triumph now stood tall under my ownership, a constant reminder of their folly. I knew they weren't done yet, that desperation often drives people to make their boldest mistakes. But as I stood there under the wide sky, the cool night breeze brushing across my face, I was ready for whatever came next. I had turned their weapon into my fortress, and I was prepared to lock the door on their arrogance forever. The fallout from the courtroom defeat should have been enough to convince any reasonable group of people to back off, lick their wounds, and move on with their lives, but the HOA was anything but reasonable. If anything, their loss only deepened their obsession with reclaiming control over me and my land, and as Chapter 5 of this ordeal began, the air in the neighborhood thickened with desperation and hostility. It was almost amusing to watch, because while they had been stripped of every ounce of legal authority, they still clung to the fantasy that they could somehow win by sheer persistence. Karen, of course, was at the center of it, barking orders at dwindling crowds of supporters, still perched on her folding chair near the gate like a queen refusing to admit her crown had been stolen. She reminded me of a gambler who had lost everything but refused to leave the table, convinced that one more roll of the dice would bring her fortune back. Their first act of defiance after the ruling was to flood the neighborhood with newsletters filled with propaganda, claiming the judge had been biased, the court documents had been tampered with, and that I had used shady tactics to trick the system. The newsletters were printed on bright paper, stuffed into mailboxes, and even taped to the gate I now owned. When I saw one fluttering there in the wind, I laughed so hard I nearly fell off my porch. It was like watching a child stomp their feet after losing a game of checkers, crying foul even as the pieces lay scattered in plain sight. The neighbors weren't fooled, though. Many of them came to me quietly, apologizing for supporting the nonsense in the first place, admitting they were embarrassed by how far it had all gone. A few even started slipping me small gestures of thanks, homemade pies, bottles of wine, or just words of encouragement. I didn't need the gifts, but every little act chipped away further at the HOA's shrinking credibility. The first subchapter of this stage unfolded with a brazen stunt that would have been unbelievable if I hadn't witnessed it myself. One morning, I woke to the sound of hammering and voices near the backside of my property. When I drove out to investigate, I found a group of board members erecting another fence, this one crudely hammered together with plywood and 2x4s, cutting across a stretch of pasture that had nothing to do with the road or the gate. I rolled up slowly, my truck rumbling, and asked them what in the world they thought they were doing. Karen, sweating and panting as she swung a hammer, declared that since I had locked the main gate, the HOA was constructing an alternative access point to reclaim authority. I nearly burst out laughing at the sheer insanity of it. They weren't even on the boundary line, they were deep into my pasture, trampling grass and scaring my cattle. I told them flatly to pack up their tools and get off my land before I called the sheriff. They glared at me, muttered about community rights, and then slunk away, leaving behind their half-built fence like a sad monument to desperation. I dragged the plywood into a pile, set it ablaze in a fire pit, and toasted marshmallows over the flames that night, savoring the sweet taste of their failure. The second subchapter brought an even stranger twist. A few days later, I noticed a pair of men in cheap uniforms loitering near the gate, clipboards in hand, trying to look official. They approached me when I walked down the road and introduced themselves as private security hired by the HOA to enforce neighborhood standard. I raised an eyebrow and asked what exactly they thought their job entailed, since the HOA had no authority over me or my property. One of them, clearly embarrassed, mumbled something about monitoring suspicious activity. I chuckled and asked if suspicious activity included ranchers feeding their horses or fixing their fences. The poor man stammered while his partner looked away, and I told them both they had two choices: leave immediately or wait for the sheriff to explain to them what trespassing meant. They left without another word, and by evening the entire neighborhood was buzzing with laughter over how Karen had wasted community funds on rent-a-cops who lasted less than an hour before being run off. The third subchapter came with the HOA's attempt to weaponize public opinion outside the neighborhood. Karen somehow managed to get a local news crew interested in the story, spinning the narrative that I was a greedy landowner holding an innocent community hostage behind a locked gate. When I saw the reporter setting up cameras near the road, I decided to let them speak first. Karen ranted into the microphone about injustice, painting herself as the victim of my tyranny, but her performance collapsed when the reporter asked a simple question about property lines. She stumbled, contradicted herself, and tried to wave it off. That was when I stepped into the frame, holding the deed and court ruling like props, calmly explaining the truth. The reporter's eyes widened as I laid out the timeline of events, ending with the fact that the HOA had built their precious gate on my property and then lost it to me legally. The segment aired that evening, and instead of earning sympathy, Karen became a laughingstock across the county. The comments online were brutal, mocking the HOA for trying to strong-arm a rancher only to hand him the keys to their own cage. The more they flailed, the more their actions turned against them. Residents started openly rebelling, refusing to pay fees, skipping meetings, even organizing their own gatherings to talk about dismantling the HOA altogether. I stayed out of those discussions, but I couldn't help feeling a surge of pride when I heard whispers that people were considering disbanding the very organization that had tried to ruin me. What had started as a campaign to control my land was now threatening the survival of the HOA itself. As their numbers dwindled and their reputation crumbled, the HOA made one final push to show strength. They decided to stage a protest at the gate, gathering as many members as they could, holding up signs that read things like "Free Our Road" and "Stop the Ranch Tyrant." I watched from my porch with binoculars, sipping iced tea, amused at the sight of grown adults chanting slogans at a gate I now owned. The protest fizzled within an hour, half the participants leaving early when they realized no one outside the neighborhood cared. By the end, Karen stood there almost alone, her voice cracking as she shouted into the empty air. It was the perfect image of what the HOA had become: noise without power, bluster without substance. The chapter closed with me walking down to the gate after the protest dispersed, locking it once again with the only key jingling in my pocket. I leaned against the bars, looking out at the empty road where their chants had echoed just hours before, and felt the kind of satisfaction that only comes from surviving a storm and watching the clouds finally break apart. The HOA had thrown everything at me: fences, fake cops, lawsuits, propaganda, even the media, and each attempt had only made them weaker. I knew they weren't entirely finished, that Karen's pride wouldn't let her quit easily, but the truth was clear now for everyone to see. The gate was mine, the land was mine, and the power they had once flaunted was nothing more than smoke in the wind. By the time Chapter 6 unfolded, the HOA was no longer a united front but a fractured mess of bickering neighbors and desperate board members who seemed more concerned with saving face than actually leading anyone. The court ruling had broken their authority, the fake security had turned into a neighborhood joke, and the protest at the gate had been a pitiful embarrassment. Still, what they lacked in dignity, they made up for in stubbornness. Karen remained determined to claw back some sense of control, even if it meant dragging the entire association down with her. I could see it in the way she stalked the neighborhood with her clipboard, still jotting down violations that no one cared about, still waving papers in people's faces as if the force of her handwriting could replace the weight of the law. The more she clung to her fantasy, the more the neighbors turned against her, and the more I realized the final act of this saga was fast approaching. The first part of this chapter began when I noticed strange vehicles driving slowly past my ranch late at night, their headlights dimmed, stopping briefly at the gate before creeping away. At first I thought it was just nosy neighbors, but then I saw men in suits and polished shoes, clearly out of place in the dusty roads around here. I found out later that Karen had tried to hire outside consultants, some sort of property dispute specialists who promised they could find a loophole in the deeds and overturn my ownership claim. She must have spent thousands of dollars of HOA funds on them, but what she didn't realize was that no loophole existed. The documents were airtight, the court ruling was clear, and the county's own surveyors had verified every line of the property. Watching those men stand outside the gate with confused faces, flipping through maps and shaking their heads, was one of the most satisfying moments yet. They left after a few days, no doubt realizing they had been conned into chasing a ghost, but the damage was already done. Word spread quickly that HOA money was being wasted on wild goose chases while residents still paid fees for nothing. The anger among her own supporters grew louder than anything I could have stirred up myself. The second part of this chapter unfolded in a more dramatic way when Karen, in her last attempt to intimidate me, called in law enforcement again. She reported that I had barricaded the community and was preventing emergency vehicles from passing through. When the sheriff's deputies arrived, I was sitting calmly on my porch, waiting for them with the paperwork in hand. They listened to her rant, her voice rising higher with every accusation, until I handed them the court ruling and deeds. The deputies nodded, told her flatly that I was well within my rights, and warned her against filing any more false reports. Karen's face turned a shade of red I didn't think possible, and she stormed off shouting that justice would find me eventually. The deputies gave me a sympathetic smile before leaving, one of them muttering under his breath that they were tired of being dragged out here for nonsense. Once again, her plan to paint me as the villain had blown up in her face, and this time the whole community witnessed it. The third part of this chapter was when I decided it was time to stop merely defending myself and start setting the tone for the future. If they wanted a fight over access, I would give them one, but on my terms. I installed a set of heavy chains across the gate, reinforcing it so only I could open it, and then posted a sign that read private property, access by permission only. The sign wasn't flashy, but it carried the weight of law, and seeing it planted there made the HOA members realize that the battle was no longer theirs to fight. The gate wasn't a symbol of their control anymore, it was the mark of their defeat, a constant reminder that their power had been turned against them. For me, it wasn't just about winning. It was about reclaiming the piece of my land and ensuring that no one could ever try to steal it from me again. Of course, Karen didn't take the reinforcement lightly. She staged one more spectacle, calling a board meeting where she declared that they would build a bypass road around my ranch to restore access for the community. The neighbors laughed at the idea, pointing out that not only would it cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, but they didn't even have the land rights to build it. Some residents walked out of the meeting altogether, shaking their heads at her delusions. By now, only a small circle of diehard loyalists remained by her side, clapping weakly as she ranted. It was like watching the last sparks of a dying fire sputter out in the wind. The climax of this chapter came a few days later when, in a desperate act of defiance, the HOA board tried to hold a neighborhood barbecue at the gate itself, claiming it was still a communal landmark. They set up tents, grills, and folding chairs, decorating the area as if they were celebrating something grand. I let them enjoy themselves for an hour or two, watching from my porch as the smoke from their grills rose into the air. Then, when the crowd was at its peak, I walked down with the key jingling in my pocket and locked the gate tight behind them. The looks on their faces when they realized they were fenced in on the wrong side of the property were priceless. Some laughed nervously, others demanded to be let out, but I told them calmly that the gate was private property now, and they should probably pack up their party before I called the sheriff to report trespassers. The panic that swept through them was pure comedy. They scrambled to gather their things, tripping over folding chairs and spilling half-cooked burgers onto the ground, rushing to get out before I made good on my word. The image of Karen dragging a half-collapsed tent while screaming at everyone to stay calm was something I would treasure for years. By the end of that night, the HOA's credibility had collapsed completely. The neighbors no longer saw me as the stubborn rancher resisting authority. They saw me as the man who had outwitted a power-hungry board at every turn, exposing their arrogance and showing them the consequences of overreach. Some even came to me afterward, shaking my hand and thanking me for standing my ground. They admitted they had been too afraid to speak out before, but now that the HOA had been humiliated so thoroughly, they felt emboldened to finally take back their neighborhood from Karen's grip. The chapter closed with me sitting by the fire pit, the stars bright above, reflecting on how far things had come. What had started with a fence built in arrogance had turned into a war of patience, strategy, and resolve. I had been tested by every trick they could muster: lawsuits, false reports, propaganda, intimidation, but each attempt had only made me stronger. The gate stood now not as a barrier to my land but as a monument to resilience, proof that no amount of entitlement could strip a man of what he rightfully owned. And as I stared into the flames, I knew the finale was near, the moment when Karen and her HOA would finally be forced to face the truth they had been avoiding all along. The gate they built to control me would be the gate that locked them in forever, and I was ready to slam it shut. By the time Chapter 7 began, the battle lines were no longer blurry but carved into the ground as deeply as the ruts in my ranch road. The HOA had been battered on every front, humiliated in court, abandoned by its own residents, and ridiculed publicly by the county and beyond. Yet, as stubborn as a mule tied to a fence post, Karen refused to surrender. It was almost admirable in its absurdity, the way she kept showing up at the gate like a general without an army, clipboard clutched to her chest, sunglasses on as if hiding the embarrassment that radiated from every pore. She tried to project confidence, but the cracks were obvious. The board meetings had shrunk to a handful of grumbling loyalists, the newsletters had stopped circulating after too many were found dumped in ditches, and even the neighbors who once cheered her on now crossed the street to avoid being dragged into another one of her rants. Still, she clung to the illusion that somehow she could turn the tide, that there was one last play left on her board. That play revealed itself one afternoon when I spotted a caravan of vehicles pulling up to the gate, cars packed with folding chairs, coolers, banners, and angry faces. It looked like a full-scale demonstration, the kind you might expect in a city square, not on a dusty ranch road in the middle of nowhere. Karen had apparently rallied the last fragments of her following and decided to make a final stand. They set up camp right outside the gate, hanging signs that screamed phrases like "Free our community" and "Stop the ranch tyrant." They shouted chants into megaphones, their voices carrying across the fields like the cries of geese that had lost their sense of direction. The whole scene was surreal, a desperate attempt to recapture the power they once imagined they held. I didn't intervene at first. I let them make their noise, let them sweat under the sun, let their voices crack from shouting into the wind. Because I knew that sooner or later, desperation always collapses under its own weight. The first part of that day played out like theater. Some of the protesters began to demand entry, rattling the bars of the gate, insisting that I was violating their right to access. A few tried climbing over, only to be met by my cattle on the other side, staring at them with bemused curiosity until the climbers scrambled back down, spooked by the snorts and stomps. Karen barked orders into her megaphone, her voice shrill, telling them to hold strong, that justice was near. But justice wasn't near. What was near was the inevitable collapse of her movement. Neighbors from outside the HOA began driving past slowly, laughing and honking at the ridiculous display. Someone even filmed it, and I knew before long the footage would make its way online, another nail in the coffin of Karen's crusade. The second part of that showdown arrived with the sheriff's deputies, summoned by Karen's endless calls. They stepped out of their cruisers, surveyed the crowd, and walked straight to me. I handed them the familiar documents, the same ones they had seen half a dozen times already. One of them sighed, told me I was within my rights, and turned to the protesters. The deputies ordered them to disperse, reminding them that they were trespassing on private land. Karen screamed that this was tyranny, that they couldn't just side with a rancher over a community. But the deputies didn't flinch. They warned her that if she didn't calm down, she would be arrested for disturbing the peace. The look on her face when those words hit her was priceless, a mix of disbelief, humiliation, and rage so strong it made her knees wobble. Some of her followers began quietly packing up their things, unwilling to be hauled off in handcuffs for a cause that was clearly lost. The third part of that day was when I decided to deliver the final blow. As the crowd thinned and the sun dipped lower in the sky, I walked slowly to the gate, the only key heavy in my pocket. Karen stood there trembling, still clutching her megaphone, her once fierce voice reduced to shaky mutters. I didn't yell or gloat or mock. I simply inserted the key, clicked the lock, and swung the gate closed with a clang that echoed like a gavel striking. Then I locked it tight and leaned against the bars, staring at the remnants of the HOA on the outside. I told them calmly that this was the end. They had built the gate to trap me, but now it was theirs to live with, theirs to stew behind, theirs to symbolize the foolishness of their arrogance. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the rustle of banners being stuffed into bags and the shuffle of feet retreating down the road. Karen stayed a little longer, her eyes glassy, before finally turning and walking away, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The aftermath of that final confrontation spread quickly through the community. Within a week, the HOA was in shambles. Members were resigning, residents were openly defying the rules, and talk of disbanding the association entirely gained momentum. Karen tried one last desperate attempt to hold power by sending out handwritten notes threatening fines, but no one took them seriously. The notes were mocked, passed around as jokes, even posted online for strangers to laugh at. The great power she once wielded had crumbled into ridicule, her empire reduced to nothing more than a pile of papers no one respected. For me, life returned to a peace I hadn't felt in months. The gate stood strong at the entrance to my ranch, no longer a symbol of conflict but of victory, of resilience, of the simple truth that entitlement never wins against patience and determination. Neighbors who once avoided me now stopped by to shake my hand, to thank me for standing up not just for myself but for everyone who had ever been steamrolled by people drunk on power. Some admitted they had been too afraid to oppose Karen before, but seeing her undone gave them the courage to finally reclaim their own voices. It was a strange feeling, becoming a kind of hero in a story I never wanted to be part of, but I accepted it with humility and a quiet satisfaction. As I sat on my porch one evening, the crickets chirping and the stars bright overhead, I reflected on the strange journey that had unfolded. What began as a morning shock of finding my driveway fenced off had spiraled into a saga of legal battles, public humiliations, desperate stunts, and finally a victory so complete it almost felt unreal. The land was mine, the gate was mine, and most importantly, the peace of my ranch was mine once again. I had faced down arrogance, entitlement, and sheer stubbornness, and I had outlasted them all. The lesson was simple but profound. You cannot fence in a man who owns the ground you stand on, and you cannot cage someone who refuses to surrender his freedom. Chapter 7 closed not with the noise of conflict but with the quiet strength of resolution. The HOA had been locked inside the walls of their own folly, and I had walked away not only victorious but unshaken. My ranch stretched out before me as it always had, the fields wide and golden, the creek running clear, the cattle grazing in peace. The only difference now was the gate at the entrance, a monument to a battle fought and won, a reminder that patience, strategy, and a little humor can turn the tide of even the most outrageous war. And as I leaned back in my chair, the night air cool on my skin, I couldn't help but smile. The saga of the HOA was over, and I had written the ending with my own hands.